Welcome to another episode of the Healthy Aging Network. My name is Kathy Tutt, and I'm the Family and Consumer Sciences Educator with Ohio State University Extension in Clark County. Joining me today is Dr. Jim Bates, and he's going to be sharing some information and some research that he does related to grandparent and grandchild relationships. So Jim, can you take just a minute and introduce yourself and tell us about the work that you do?
Sure. Thanks, Kathy. It's a pleasure to be with you, everyone, and to be able to talk about something I am passionate about, and that is grandparent-grandchild relationships. I am a field specialist of family wellness and have been with Ohio State for going on 8 years. It's one of my most favorite things to talk about, and I've been studying grandparents for just about 15 years.
Great. Thank you so much. So when we begin to talk about the idea of grandparenting, can you go a little bit into some of the research and the information that you've used in your programming?
Yes. So over these past 15 years, there are things that just have come to the surface, things that keep coming up, and there's also new things that are very interesting to consider. And so I've titled this presentation, The Bonds of Anguish, Ambivalence and Love, and subtitled it, Navigating Grandparent-Grandchild Relationships. Because I think in a lot of grandparent-grandchild relationships, there's an aspect of each of these three emotions embedded into those relationships. Like all types of family relationships, those that span the generations can be wonderful and meaningful, but they can also be challenging and disappointing. And there's complexity, and there are just people and personalities, and it can be challenging sometimes. These relationships that involve grandparents and grandchildren, there's also these numerous developmental, relational, psychological benefits available to family members who learn to navigate these relationships successfully. And so advice for grandparents, parents, and grandchildren will be offered very freely during our time together. The agenda for today is, first, a little bit of background about grandparents, talk about what does this word anguish mean, and how does it fit into these relationships. Next, we'll talk about ambivalence. And what in the world is ambivalence? We'll talk about love, and then some tips and benefits for those people who are trying to navigate this and wanting to do it successfully.
So do you want to give me just a little bit of information about some of the research related to grandparenting and grandparent relationships? I know that you've studied this in depth, and I think it's kind of interesting to share some of the statistics and some of the numbers that we have.
So Kathy, back a couple of years ago, I was able to obtain some data that was collected in 2008. Up to that point, nobody had ever tried to figure out how many grandparents there were in the United States. Well, in 2008, the question was asked in a nationwide survey if people were a grandparent. And so we were able to, I was able to get that information with a little bit of help from the person who participated in collecting that data, and was able to run the numbers. And I found that there are an estimated 27 million grandfathers in the United States and 36 million grandmothers in the United States. Some research from the 1980s has found that there are grandmothers as young as 27 and great-grandmothers as young as 56. In fact, I was talking to a grandmother today. I've started a research study investigating grandparents' experiences during the coronavirus pandemic. And this grandmother that I was talking to, she was 68, and she had 7 great-grandchildren and 22 grandchildren, and she had 2 great-grandchildren still on the way. So, these families, these 4 and 5 generation families are not uncommon. And it's also interesting that grandfathers, in terms of the the research about grandmothers and grandfathers is that in the past, we've kind of smushed them all together. We've collected data from grandmothers and grandfathers, and we've squished them all together in our research reports, and we just label the study about grandparents. Well, really the focus that we're trying to kind of figure out is, how are grandmothers and grandfathers different? And compared to grandfathers, grandmothers typically have more contact with their grandchildren, are more emotionally close to their grandchildren, or typically more involved, and grandchildren seem to report that their grandmothers understand them better. And so this has kind of led scholars to think about grandmothers and grandfathers as two different entities, and that these relationships really have a matrifocal tilt, which is just a kind of a focus on grandmothers and grandmothering, and on the matriarchal lines in the family. And back in the 60s, somebody wrote in a research report, grandfathers, they're simply masculinized grandmothers. And so it was just kind of this interesting way of talking about grandmothers and grandfathers, that they do a lot of things that are similar, but that they have very important differences and distinctions, especially when it comes to grandchildren. And that the point about grandparents having certain roles and specific roles in the family is also key. Now, we've found that grandfathers and grandmothers both play the role of family historian, a teacher, advisor, mentor, nurturer, a role model, a fun seeker, almost like a playmate, a teacher of family culture, someone who's trying to pass on the culture of the family, whether that's through food or whether that's through things that the family does together. Maybe it's farming, maybe it's a family business, but it could also be through crafts and things that are done in a creative way as well. So we have surrogate parents, or sometimes, a caregiver or a babysitter, a financial provider, and someone who invests in the grandchild's future, someone who puts money away so the grandchild can have that money for an education, or to buy a house or buy a car later in their lives. So we've seen, and it's funny, in the research study that I'm conducting as we speak, these last several weeks, I've been interviewing all these grandmothers and grandfathers about the coronavirus pandemic and their experiences, that I'm seeing that these grandparents are all of these, or are exhibiting each of these different roles that I've just mentioned. And so taking a slightly different perspective on this is this idea of a grandparent style, grandparenting style. And it's really just a collection of behaviors that define how grandparents approach the role of grandparenthood. And we've been studying this. It goes back to the 1960s, 1964, when there was a group of researchers who were interested in this. And we see kind of the same types of styles coming up, decade after decade, as we try to replicate these studies. And in my own research, we have found, me and my co-author Alan Taylor, we found that there are grandfathers and grandmothers who are involved. There are grandparents who are disengaged. And then there are grandparents who are just kind of right in the middle, that they're passive. And so there are all these kind of different ways of thinking about the role of grandparent, and how those grandparents do that role, and how the grandchildren perceive their role, their grandparents' role in the family.
Very nice. So as we go through, and we're talking about the different types of bonds that are met within a family. Oops, sorry about that. So can you tell me a little bit, this bonds of anguish? So explain that to me and give me some background and some understanding of how those actually come about.
So the bonds of anguish, the bonds of ambivalence, and the bonds of love, those seem to be these complex emotions that are part of intergenerational family relationships. And so in the research and in our personal lives, we see these bonds of anguish, whether they're family feuds, these differences between whether it's in the parent generation, the grandparent generation, between the grandparents and the grandchildren, between the parents and and their children. And so there are disagreements that happen. And these can also be a cause or caused by the fissures that I'm calling here. And the fissures are really this abuse, abandonment. It could be just as simple as geographic distance. One grandparent lives in India and the grandchild lives here in the United States. Grandparents who also have Alzheimer's disease or dementia, who are physically present, but they're just not psychologically available to their grandchildren. There are also frustrations with parents. The parents can hold, all the cards if, the grandparents really want to have access to those grandchildren, but the parents simply won't let them. So there are these fissures that happen in families. And then there are things that are just misunderstandings that over time are kind of these minor misunderstandings that cause some hard feelings. And they may not turn into a feud or be caused by a fissure, but they're just simply just misunderstandings between the generations. We've also found that there are grandparents who have grandchildren with special needs, and that's just a very difficult situation sometimes for these grandparents, and that they feel so badly for their grandchildren, and also they feel badly for their own children who have to adjust their lives to meet the needs of their special needs grandchild. And then there's also in the research this focus on a few studies on death and dying, and that grandparents have lost a grandchild, and that they again feel just this deep sadness for themselves and for their son or daughter, the parents of the grandchild.
You mentioned the next one, which was the bonds of ambivalence. Could you explain that to me a little bit more and kind of give me some idea of what might lead to this type of bond?
So ambivalence is just a fascinating concept and a fascinating emotion. And it really is what it's defined as is a contradiction and a tension in relationships that simply cannot be reconciled. So the way that this plays out is that there's this tension between these feelings that we might have for our grandchildren. And one of them is, and we hear this often expressed, I'm happy to see my grandkids. I love it when they come and visit, but I am happy to see them go. And that we love our grandchildren, but we also love the time that we have to be just by ourselves or just with our spouse, or we love that quiet time we often hear. And so sometimes there's this annoyance that can pop up. And we've also seen in the literature grandchildren talking about their grandparents, that sometimes they're a little bit annoyed with their grandparents. And that they need some, that there's a point at which they've had too much contact with the grandparent or too much contact with the grandchild, and that they need to separate for a time and kind of regroup and then re-engage with each other at a later date. And there's also these choices made by parents or by grandchildren that are annoying or that have these consequences for the grandparent. In fact, I heard that this morning on an interview that I was conducting with a grandmother. She said, I was upset with my son when he was, you know, when he had his baby. He was just out of 12th grade, she said, and he had this baby, and I wanted them to go to school and go to college, but they didn't, and they had this baby, and she said, you know, I wasn't ready to become a grandmother, but as time got closer to when the baby was going to be born, this grandmother got more and more and more excited. And then when the baby was born, she had these pictures. In fact, she was in the room with her daughter-in-law and her son, and she was in the room and was there when the baby was born. She was just so excited. So there are these multiple emotions that we feel.
Now, in your opinion, is the ambivalence, is that impacted at all by the amount of time that the grandchildren spend with their grandkids, or, you know, a feeling maybe of obligation to care for them?
Yes. And there's this, what is called the norm of non-interference. And that was coined in the 80s. And so there's this tension that grandparents have with parents, is that, you know, parents are often saying, you know, I don't want your advice. I don't need your advice. But when I do need your advice, I need you to be there. Or I don't want you to be involved right now, mom or dad. But when I need you, I really need you, and I need you to be there immediately and to help me out. And so there's the norm of non-interference that parents are like, well, wait until you're asked, versus this expectation of simply being there that grandparents have, like, that they want to be present, they want to be helpful. And so sometimes there's this feeling of obligation that just is hard to reconcile. They want to be present, but then they have to wait until they're asked by the parent. And then there's some grandparents who are like, I don't want to participate, but I don't want to be that involved. I don't want to be babysitting all the time. I don't want to have the grandchildren over here all the time. But that there's this expectation by the parents that they need to be willing and able, when there's a crisis, or even when there's not a crisis, to be able to take the grandchildren on, even though the grandparents may want that space.
I think it's really interesting that we go through and we talk about those two types of bonds that people don't share a lot about that. You know, it's kind of one of those conversations that they may have with their spouse or with a close friend, but it's not something that we promote widely amongst, you know, the general public. The one that we do promote, though, is the bonds of love. So we all are, you know, we hear a lot, and people love to share their stuff on social media about, you know, their perfect family relationships. So let's talk about these bonds of love, and have you give me some ideas of where those may come into play.
This is what we like to talk about and like to focus on, as you mentioned. And nurturance, support, influence, involvement, emotional closeness. These are all those emotions and actions that demonstrate love, demonstrate care, demonstrate an interest in being all together, and an interest in the continuation of the family. And connection specifically is, you know, this is a strong relationship beyond simply being blood relatives. And it's also interesting that this connection can be done face to face, can be developed and maintained, you know, face to face, but it can also be maintained over the internet or Facebook. I had a student at one time, she said, yeah, my grandma stalks me on Facebook, or she's on there just to see my pictures, you know. And it's funny because grandparents have told me, and this was an informal question that I asked of a handful of grandparents, and they respond. I just asked them, you know, how often do you connect with your grandchildren? And Do you try to reach out to them and things like that? And they said, oh, our grandchildren are too busy. I don't want to be a burden to them. And they have so much going on, and I don't want to interfere in their lives and so on. Well, it turns out that grandchildren are like, I don't mind my grandparents being involved in my life or contacting me or things like that. And so sometimes we have to clarify those expectations a little bit. And but for grandparents, the nurturance and the support, the influence, the involvement, the emotional closeness, and the connection, those all change. And the actions that we do to create support, create nurturance, and to be influential, those differ as the grandchildren get older. And they're different when they're babies and when they're toddlers, preschoolers, teenagers, and adults. And so grandparents are always adjusting, just as parents are always adjusting to as the child grows and develops.
So, can you give us just some tips for grandparents as far as building these relationships, building these bonds, or the roles that they might play?
Yeah, so, if your goal is to build and maintain a healthy, meaningful grandparent-grandchild relationship, then how do we go about doing that? And there's just two ways, or two tips that I have here for grandparents. The first is, respect the parents' wishes, and ask them if you can do what you want to do. Don't be afraid to ask. And if the parents are saying, no, I don't want to do that right now, then just respect those wishes and move on to the next opportunity. Also embedded in that aspect of respect the parents is this idea that the parents are the legal guardians of the grandchild. And so those parents may have certain rules and routines that they would like continued, and they would like the grandchild to learn and to begin to practice. So do your best to continue to support the parent in those parenting efforts. And then the second is, offer support to both parents, not just your son or your daughter, but to your son or daughter-in-law. Get to know them, welcome them into the family. That way you're supporting the entire family, including the grandchildren, and you're able to be that much more helpful and effective.
And so what about some tips for the parents of the children, not necessarily the grandparents, but your adult children?
So encourage the connection between your child and your parents or your parents-in-law, so that, when it's safe, open that gate, let the grandparents in, let the grandchildren out, and let them interact with each other. Really encourage and facilitate the relationship by getting them together, inviting them over for the grandchild's birthday parties, celebrations, and religious connections, religious ceremonies. Include the grandparents in all that you're doing with that grandchild, those celebrations, because grandparents love to be there for the graduations, for the birthdays, those important events. And try not to let the little things bother you.
So how about tips for grandchildren to foster these relationships?
Okay, so I keep hearing over and over again, remember your manners, be polite, be respectful, be courteous. Grandparents love to see grandchildren grow and develop, but they also want to see that you're being respectful and that you're learning to become a contributing member of society. So, reach out to your grandparents when you're a little bit older. Make an effort to contact them and celebrate them. Celebrate their birthdays. Remember them in little ways. Offer to help out. Sometimes you might have to insist when you are trying to help out, insist on helping them out with whatever it is. Sometimes grandparents can be stubborn that way. But being persistent and insistent can help those grandparents open up. And, they may not want to, admit their limitations, but you can be helpful to them as they age and as things come up in their lives.
So we have just a few more minutes left, and I wanted to have you share with me some of the benefits of grandparent and grandchild relationships. I know that you do a program called Grilling with My Granddad or Grandchild, and you've seen some of these benefits firsthand. So if you could, please just share with us for a minute and help us understand why it's so important to build these relationships.
Well, I think it is what we're trying to do with Grilling with My Grandchild is to connect those generations, to open up a channel of communication between the grandfather and the grandchild so that they can kind of just be normal with each other and around each other, so they're comfortable being around each other. And so, we've seen that in some other research that men who are involved in their grandchildren's lives, they have better mental health. And they also have a stronger relationship. They are more satisfied in their relationship. And there's greater family functioning. Like there's less tension and less contention when the family members are getting along. And it's been fantastic to do the Grilling with My Grandchild program in several counties here in Ohio that have been able to meet just a lot of these grandparents, and they just love their grandchild. The grandchild is sometimes a little bit timid, but they are very respectful, and they love to be learning, and they love to be participating in something with their grandparent.
Thank you so much, Jim. So I do have your contact information here, Dr. Jim Bates. You'll see his email address as well as the way to contact him. Is there any last final thoughts that you'd like to share before we end the session today?
Just that intergenerational family relationships, grandparent-grandchild relationships can be a meaningful source of for a grandchild to grow and to develop and to learn and to become, to reach their potential. And I think that grandchildren who have access to grandparents can learn from them, can be open to enjoying their grandparents' company, and that their lives can be enriched by strengthening that relationship with their grandparents. And also for grandparents, that their lives can be strengthened and benefited by interacting with their grandchildren. Thanks, Kathy.
Thank you, Dr. Bates.